Oberyn Martell stood upon the charred stones of kings, landing with fire in his eyes and vengeance in his heart. The air smelled of ash and old blood, but the taste of fear and betrayal was far more pungent than any scent the wind carried. Bodies littered the streets in the wake of the sack, and the only sounds were the distant cries of the grieving, the crackle of dying flames, and the rasp of steel boots scraping across rubble-strewn ground. Somewhere in the Red Keep, his sister Elia was besieged by the men who served the Lannisters. Rumors had reached his ears, rumors that Tywin's loyal dogs had broken into the royal chambers. The names whispered in terror were Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch, men who reveled in cruelty. He had come too late, or so he feared. For all his cunning, for all his fiery spirit, Oberyn had been away when the city fell, having traveled in haste toward King's Landing upon hearing that Aerys Targaryen was near his end. The shape of politics had changed faster than ravens could fly, and now the Mad King's era was over. The capital's gates had opened to Tywin Lannister, the lion who had crouched in wait, pretending neutrality until the moment he could strike. Oberyn had arrived just after the Golden Lion's men had been unleashed upon the populace, and the cruelty with which they inflicted Tywin's brand of service to the new king was unparalleled. He refused to think about his sister's fate, because to imagine it was to lose himself in fury. He had sworn to fight for the justice of House Martell, to defend his family's honor at all costs, and that included Elia's children, Rhaenys and Aegon, the very future of House Targaryen as well. Some said the children were already beyond rescue. Some said that half the Red Keep was drenched in blood. He would not believe that. Oberyn Martell was no stranger to impossible odds. Though he had only a small retinue of his most trusted men, Dorne's famous spears, he was certain that their skill and cunning could outmatch the savage impulses of brutes like Clegane, if only they were quick enough. He stalked through the corridors that wound up toward the royal apartments. The once grand carpets were torn and blood-stained, and gold-leaf walls were marred by soot, the marks of torches and errant swords. Servants who had not fled cowered behind broken furniture. Some had been killed outright, their blood stiffening the fabric of their clothes. Every corpse became a heavier weight upon Oberyn's conscience, reminding him that he needed to move faster. If Elia had fallen already, if her children had been butchered, his stomach churned with the threat of rage that might one day consume him. He would not let that happen, not without fighting. "Prince Oberyn," hissed one of his men, a lean Dornish warrior with an arrow nocked. "We must hurry. I hear shouting up ahead." Oberyn nodded once, jaw tight. He remembered Elia as a child, teasing him in the water gardens, her dark hair shimmering in the sun. He remembered how she'd cared for her children when they were infants, the love and softness in her voice. Now that same gentle heart was in danger of being torn apart by monsters who served a house that presumed itself a friend to the Iron Throne. He could not stomach it. His retinue of 6 men, all dressed in leather and steel, advanced swiftly. Oberyn himself carried a spear nearly as tall as he was, its steel point gleaming with a deadly promise. They passed the body of a Targaryen guard pinned to the wall with a sword through the stomach. The Dornishman who walked behind him spat. "Lannister scum," he growled. Another scream tore through the halls, and Oberyn's pulse hammered in his ears. He sprinted forward, ignoring the ache in his muscles that came from pushing himself so hard. The corridor opened onto a large receiving room whose door hung off a broken hinge. Inside, the place was in shambles, furniture overturned, embroidered cushions ripped, and tapestries burning from the corners, as if some savage beast had raged there. Blood smeared the floor, telling the tale of a violent struggle. His heart lurched. He saw Elia pressed against a far wall, disheveled and trembling, her dress torn at the sleeves, her face pale with horror. She clutched her children close. Rhaenys, the older one, with tears streaming down her cheeks, and baby Aegon, silent with shock in his mother's arms. Before them stood Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, a hulking mass of muscle and brutality. His sword was red at the tip, and Oberyn saw with fresh disgust that the blood was not Elia's or the children's, for they had but a few bruises and scrapes. The gore likely belonged to a Targaryen knight who lay sprawled between them, cut nearly in half. The mountain turned slowly as Oberyn and his men stormed in. The monstrous knight was not alone. A pair of Lannister soldiers, broad-faced and leering, made crude remarks as they advanced on Elia. Seeing Oberyn, they hesitated. One step, two steps, and then the tension broke. Clegane bellowed, "More Dornish!" He swung his sword in a wide arc as though readying it to cut down anything in range. "You do well to scuttle back to the sands you crawled from, whelp," Elia screamed, "Oberyn!" as if her last shred of hope were pinned upon his arrival. But Oberyn was done speaking. He sprang forward with the lethal speed that had earned him his nickname, the Red Viper. He thrust with his spear, aiming to skewer Gregor through the throat if he could. Gregor parried the blow with surprising deftness, his monstrous arms swinging the sword as though it were an extension of his own body. The clang of steel against steel rang like a shriek in the devastated chamber. A flurry of movement followed. Oberyn's men fanned out, each taking on one of the Lannister soldiers, while Oberyn engaged Gregor directly. The mountain loomed over him, nearly half again as wide. Oberyn found himself thinking not of the massive man's size, but of his sister behind him, her children clutched in trembling arms. He would not let that man get near them again. He feinted a low thrust, forcing Gregor to twist his body, and then lunged for the gap in his armor near the armpit. He struck steel, but it penetrated deeper than he expected. Gregor howled and reeled back, pulling away from the embedded spear. Blood seeped from the wound, and in that moment, Oberyn's eyes gleamed with fury. But Gregor was not so easily felled. He still gripped his sword, and he swung wildly, narrowly missing Oberyn's face. The blow's wind alone would have knocked a lesser man flat. Oberyn tore his spear free just in time to parry the next assault. The mountain's blade came down in a bone-shaking blow, and Oberyn stepped aside, letting the huge weapon smash into the stone floor and chip it. The Red Viper's heart pounded. He didn't have time for a prolonged battle. More Lannister men could burst into the chamber at any moment. He needed a killing stroke. Their weapons clashed again, and Oberyn darted in close, using his smaller size to pivot behind Gregor. He stabbed at the back of Gregor's knee, flesh unprotected by plate. The mountain roared in pain, half lurching. Oberyn slid the spear point out. The giant man swayed, but his anger fueled him, and he managed to spin around with a savage swing. Oberyn ducked, but the tip of the blade raked across his shoulder. White-hot agony shot through him. He hissed but maintained his stance. Pain was no stranger to the Red Viper. In his peripheral vision, he saw one of his men stab a Lannister soldier in the gut, while the other soldier crashed to the floor with a knife in his throat. That left Gregor alone and wounded. Elia was behind Oberyn, her eyes locked on the furious battle. Gregor staggered, blood pooling beneath him from his wounded leg and armpit, but he was still dangerous. His eyes were rabid, and his breath came in harsh rasps from behind the visor slit. With a growl, Oberyn lunged again, driving the spear with all his strength. This time, the point slid under Gregor's breastplate at a diagonal, finding the chainmail gap near his collarbone. A hideous noise, half gasp, half roar, escaped Gregor's mouth. For an instant he reeled, as though he might yet chop Oberyn in half. But the Red Viper twisted the spear viciously, using the leverage of the shaft to saw deeper into muscle and bone. Gregor Clegane's eyes went wide with shock and rage. Blood poured out of his mouth, and he managed one last hateful bellow. Then he sank to his knees, sword clattering from his limp hand. With a final grimace, Oberyn yanked the spear free. The mountain collapsed face first, twitching once before going still. Elia's sob of relief filled the chamber. The smell of blood was thick. Oberyn stood panting over the hulking corpse, his grip on the spear so tight his knuckles had gone white. Slowly, he turned to face his sister. She clung to Rhaenys and Aegon, both children shaking. "Oberyn," she said again, tears spattering her cheeks. "You came. By the Seven, you came." He rushed to her side, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Elia practically collapsed into his arms, face pressed against his neck. "We have to get you out of here," he told her, voice tight. He cradled her face between his hands for a moment, scanning for injuries. She was bruised, exhausted, but alive. Rhaenys had a small cut on her forehead, and baby Aegon was red-faced, but mercifully unharmed. "Is it safe?" she asked, the words near a whisper. "King's Landing is lost," Oberyn replied. "Tywin's men are everywhere. We must flee." His men were already moving, searching the room for anything useful. Cloaks, perhaps, to disguise the children, scraps of gold to finance their flight. Another retainer knelt by the Lannister soldiers, checking if any still drew breath. When he found none alive, he tossed aside the weapons with a sneer. Elia trembled, hugging her children. How can we possibly escape?" Oberyn answered with quiet resolve. "I will lead you out. There are ways. Once we are beyond the city's walls, we can ride for Dorne." He swallowed. "Or if that fails, then we flee across the sea." He did not voice all of his fears. If Tywin Lannister had orchestrated such cruelty, then no corner of the Seven Kingdoms might be safe for the Targaryen heirs, not even Dorne. Robert Baratheon, the new claimant to the throne, would have no love for the children of Rhaegar Targaryen. Oberyn was no fool. He suspected that as soon as Robert was crowned, or perhaps even before, he would want those children dead to avoid future rebellions in their name. And if they discovered Elia was alive, she, too, might be killed as a matter of convenience. He steeled himself. Better to get them out now and let the political storms pass while they remained hidden. He might have to remain hidden himself. The thought both enraged and sobered him. For Elia's and the children's lives, he would do anything, even swallow his pride. They moved quickly, leaving the Red Keep behind like an abandoned crypt. They passed more atrocities along the way, evidence of Tywin's men fulfilling the unspoken command to root out and destroy any Targaryen loyalty. Oberyn's men scouted ahead, ensuring that no large Lannister patrol lay in wait. At times, they had to wait in the shadows while groups of soldiers marched past, cackling about their spoils of war. Elia trembled whenever she heard them. She clutched baby Aegon to her chest so he would not cry and betray their position. Rhaenys held tightly to Oberyn's belt with one hand, wide-eyed with terror. Eventually, in the dead of night, Oberyn and his small retinue slipped through a lesser-known postern gate. A few guards stood watch, but they were too drunk on Lannister gold, or perhaps simply too drunk, to notice the sudden flurry of movement until it was too late. Oberyn's men dispatched them quietly. The family darted away into the darkness beyond the city's walls, leaving behind the glow of fires and the smell of corpses. Only when they were miles from King's Landing did they stop. The road south lay open, but Oberyn's instincts whispered caution. It was the obvious path. Robert's men, and perhaps Lannister outriders, would anticipate them heading to Dorne. They needed to vanish in a way that no one would expect. Oberyn thought quickly. If he went south, they might be intercepted. If they fled west, they ran into Lannister territories. North was out of the question. East remained. East meant the sea. Elia, swaying on her feet, asked, "Where are we going?" He looked at her. "Somewhere safe. For now, a hidden cove along the coast. We can find a ship." Her face was ashen, streaked with tears, but she nodded as if any direction Oberyn chose was better than remaining near King's Landing. She was wise enough to realize that her children's survival demanded absolute secrecy, and in Oberyn's eyes, she saw the unwavering commitment to keep them alive. They traveled for days, avoiding main roads and halting in the remotest of hamlets only long enough to buy or beg for supplies. They slept beneath trees or in the nooks of rocky outcrops. Oberyn's men stood watch in shifts, always alert for the sound of hooves. Days turned into nights in an exhausting blur. Rhaenys grew silent, her once lively personality subdued by trauma and fear. Aegon, still too young to understand, merely fussed when hungry or cold, but otherwise slept in his mother's arms. At last, they reached a small fishing village nestled along a lonely stretch of the Blackwater Bay. Most of the villagers had been forced to feed the Lannister horde or had fled to avoid the war, so the place was half empty. Oberyn's men found a fisherman willing to sell them a small skiff for an outrageous price. Oberyn paid without haggling, pressing gold dragons into the man's hand, telling him that if anyone asked, he'd never seen them. That night, under a moon veiled by clouds, Oberyn, Elia, the children, and the surviving Dornish warriors set sail. The skiff bobbed uncertainly on the black water, but after a few hours they reached the mouth of a larger trading route. With luck, they might intercept a merchant ship. Fortune proved to be with them, or at least not wholly against them. Before dawn, they hailed a Braavosi merchant cog heading north. The Braavosi captain was wary at first, but a pouch of gold and the promise of more convinced him to allow Oberyn and his family aboard. In hushed tones, Oberyn warned the captain not to speak of who they were. The captain gave no guarantees, but coins often bought silence. So began their voyage across the narrow sea, a voyage that felt unreal to Oberyn, as if the entire world had shifted beneath his feet. He had never intended to flee Westeros, not with House Martell's pride so deeply rooted in the desert sands. But the smell of salt air and the creak of foreign sails told him that, for now, he must follow necessity. He had saved Elia and her children from a horrific fate, but in doing so, he had turned them all into exiles. During the crossing, Elia rarely ventured from the cramped cabin. She seemed determined to hold her children close, as though any lapse might invite tragedy. Oberyn spent his days and nights pacing the deck, scanning the horizon for the banners of any warship that might be pursuing them. None appeared. Meanwhile, the Braavosi captain joked with his mates in their lilting accent, occasionally nodding politely at Oberyn but never asking too many questions. Gold was gold. Men had fought for less, and men had died for more. When they reached Braavos, Oberyn considered disembarking. The Titan city was a bustling metropolis of canals, coin, and conflict, yet anonymity could be bought with the right contacts. But even Braavos was not necessarily safe from assassins if Robert Baratheon, or Tywin Lannister, truly wished to see Elia and her children dead. The Iron Bank might remain neutral, but the city was filled with spies of many realms. So Oberyn led his family further east, sailing from Braavos to Pentos, from Pentos to Myr, from Myr to Tyrosh, as if hoping that endless movement would shield them. But an endless flight would only wear them down, empty their coffers, and offer no chance to reclaim any life. They needed more than hiding. They needed power. After several weeks of uncertain travel, Oberyn arrived with Elia and the children in Sunspear's old ally, the city of Pentos. Pentos was known for its wealthy magisters, lavish feasts, and cunning politics. Though Oberyn was not naive enough to wholly trust any magister, Pentos offered certain advantages. The city's merchants had ties to Dorne, smugglers who might still be loyal or indebted to House Martell. There was also the possibility of forging alliances with various Sellsword companies. Oberyn had always been adept at forging alliances, even if some were temporary. He rented a modest villa on the outskirts of Pentos, near the meandering waterways that fed into the bay. The estate was walled, with its own small garden and enough rooms to ensure privacy. He set up a guard rotation with his loyal men. At first, Elia objected, fearing that staying in one place for too long was an invitation for trouble. But Oberyn reasoned that their frantic pace had to end at some point. The children were exhausted. Aegon had fallen ill with a fever on the last ship, and Rhaenys was clearly traumatized. Constant flight was no way to live, not for children who had once been heirs to the greatest dynasty in Westeros. So they settled in Pentos quietly. Oberyn instructed his men to spread rumors that the woman and children staying in his villa were merely distant Dornish relatives, nobodies of note. He limited his own comings and goings, adopting a new name for public dealings, a lesser name, but his distinct looks and accent could not be fully concealed. Still, Pentos was home to many travelers from across the narrow sea. He told curious folk he was a wealthy Sellsword or perhaps a merchant of spices. Over time, those who observed him learned to keep their questions to themselves. The aura of danger around him was enough to discourage idle curiosity. Within the privacy of the villa, Oberyn and Elia tried to piece their lives back together, at least for the children's sake. Rhaenys would not talk about King's Landing, and Elia chose not to push. Instead, she sang lullabies and brushed her daughter's hair at night, coaxing forth some semblance of normalcy. Aegon's fever broke, and he grew into a lively toddler, fascinated by the bright silks and exotic foods of Pentos. From time to time, Oberyn would find small joys in seeing the children laugh or chase each other through the garden. Yet, in the back of his mind, he was always aware that danger lurked. In the weeks that followed, Oberyn realized that their survival required more than secrecy. They needed resources and not just gold. Gold could buy them mercenaries, yes, but the moment House Baratheon or House Lannister offered a higher price, those mercenaries might turn. Pentos was a city of illusions, where a prince might be a pauper by next moon's turn. Oberyn had to think bigger. He began discreetly seeking out companions from his youth. Over the years, Oberyn had traveled across Essos, dabbled in the free cities, even visited the famed fighting pits of Meereen. He knew that alliances here could be fickle but also deeply profitable if forged with the right blade or coin. He established contact with a few old friends among the Sellsword companies, the Second Sons, the Bright Banners, and a lesser-known group called the Broken Spear. He also reached out to merchants from Volantis who might have cause to travel west. One evening, after securing the children safely in the villa, Oberyn donned a plain cloak, armed himself with a dagger, and headed into the heart of Pentos to attend a clandestine meeting. In a dimly lit wine cellar, he found himself face to face with a captain of the Golden Company. This famed Sellsword company was known for its discipline and for being founded by the Blackfyre Pretenders, exiled Targaryen bastards from a past rebellion. If anyone might be sympathetic or at least pragmatic about harboring Targaryen heirs, it might be them. The captain eyed Oberyn skeptically across a small wooden table. A single lantern flickered, casting shadows on the captain's scarred cheeks. "You have the look of Dorne about you," he remarked. "They say the Dornish are a proud lot. Why come to the Golden Company for an alliance?" Oberyn answered carefully, "Because I have good reason to believe we share a mutual interest. Word on the wind says you hold to your vows, even across generations. Our word is good as gold, is it not?" The captain tilted his head. "A motto we strive to uphold, but gold is gold, friend. To buy our service is not a small thing." Oberyn's lips curved slightly. "I am no friend, not yet, but I seek a certain arrangement. There are children of high birth, who may one day have a claim in Westeros. I need to ensure their safety while also preparing for a potential restoration of their rights." The Sellsword's expression did not immediately reveal shock or interest. He merely sipped from his cup. "Rights, claims. The Golden Company has sailed west before on behalf of Targaryen interests, usually ended in blood. If you are implying the Targaryens still have living heirs." Oberyn held up a finger in caution. "I do not speak openly of such matters. I merely say that if such heirs existed, the Golden Company might find themselves in a profitable position, should those heirs ever choose to press a claim." They stared at each other a long moment. The air in the cellar seemed to thicken with the weight of possibility. Finally, the captain said, "If you have coin enough, and if your cause aligns with our founder's creed, we might offer protection. But do not think to buy us cheaply, or tie us down without a real promise. Many have tried to manipulate the Golden Company. Few succeed." "I have no intention of manipulation," Oberyn said. "I have intentions of building something. War in Westeros may be over for the moment, but you and I both know how fragile that peace is. The new King Robert sits on the throne, but half the realm is battered and bleeding. The Lannisters have grown in power, but they are not unassailable. The Tyrells still brood in Highgarden. The Greyjoys in the Iron Islands remain unruly. Meanwhile, in the east, new powers are always emerging or fracturing. One day, the realm will be ripe for a change." He leaned forward, eyes gleaming with that unquenchable Dornish fire. "I am not promising immediate war, nor immediate claims. I am telling you that if we work together to keep certain children safe, and to gather support among the exiled lords and knights of Westeros who find their way to Essos, then one day we may forge a formidable alliance. One day, if the Iron Throne falters, there will be a banner for Targaryen loyalists to rally around. The Golden Company's backing could tip the scales. The captain considered his words. You think far ahead, but what do you seek in the short term? Security, Oberyn replied. For the children, for their mother, for me and those who stand beside us. I want no assassins sneaking into our villa. I want no bravos with sharp knives seeking to collect a bounty on Targaryen heirs. At that admission, the captain's gaze sharpened. So it is true, then. They live. Oberyn shrugged, neither confirming nor denying with words, but his silence spoke volumes. I am prepared to pay for a garrison of your men, or to arrange a retainer that ensures our protection. In return, you will have the gratitude of House Martell. And perhaps, in time, more than that. The man from the Golden Company ran a thumb across the old scar on his chin. We do not come cheap, but if your gold is good, and if your cause is of interest to our high officers, we can come to an arrangement. We'll need to discuss details. This is no small matter. So began Oberyn Martell's delicate courtship of the Golden Company. He knew that once they heard the full truth, they might demand far more gold than he currently possessed. But he also knew the company's storied history, how it was founded by exiles who once rallied behind Targaryen blood. If any Sellsword company might be loyal, it was this one, or at least loyal enough to keep them alive. Days and nights in Pentos passed in anxious negotiation. Oberyn met with various captains, each with their own demands. The Golden Company had sponsors in Lys, in Myr, in Tyrosh, all of whom might want a say in such a dangerous secret. Oberyn proved himself adept at these political maneuvers, employing both charm and subtle threats. At times, the cost seemed too great, and he feared a single slip of the tongue could bring Robert's wrath across the sea. But the memory of the moment he had found Elia and her children cornered by Gregor Clegane reminded him that he had no choice. He must protect them at all costs. Elia, for her part, spent long hours reading letters from Dorne. Oberyn had managed to smuggle messages to Prince Doran, their elder brother. The Prince of Dorne was overjoyed to learn that Elia and the children still lived, though how that joy manifested in secret was unknown. Doran Martell was cautious, methodical, and quiet in his rage. He had to be, for House Martell remained part of the Seven Kingdoms. Doran advised Oberyn to remain hidden and said that overtly supporting Targaryen heirs at that moment would be too dangerous. But in subtle ways, Doran provided gold, sending shipments through trusted merchants to help sustain Oberyn's endeavors. Thus, Oberyn's villa in Pentos slowly became a small fortress of sorts. The Golden Company agreed to station a handful of their best men there, disguised as guards or household staff. They would rotate every few months, ensuring no single group could betray the entire arrangement. Oberyn's Dornish retinue grew in numbers, too, as a few loyalists fled Westeros for fear of Baratheon retribution and found their way east. The children were never allowed to leave the estate without strong escorts. In time, Rhaenys no longer flinched at every strange noise, and Aegon toddled about the garden, giggling at the exotic birds that nested in the olive trees. But Oberyn did not remain idle. Having secured a fragile peace in Pentos, he looked to the other free cities. If he was to build power in Essos, it would not be enough to linger in one city paying off Sellswords. He needed influence, trade connections, a personal network of allies. And so he began to travel again, albeit in carefully measured steps. He journeyed to Lys under the pretense of meeting with spice traders, forging a contract that allowed him to import various exotic goods back to Pentos. He used these goods to broker deals with local magisters. He visited Volantis, taking advantage of an old friend's position in the merchant oligarchy there to arrange a protective alliance for certain caravans. Step by step, Oberyn wove a web of commerce and favors that made him a man of significance in Essos, if not a formal ruler. With every new alliance, Oberyn earned fresh coin to fund the Golden Company's services. He also learned more of the world beyond Westeros, of Dothraki Khalasars that roamed the plains, of the slaver cities along Slaver's Bay, and of far-off lands beyond the Red Waste. He considered them all potential pieces in a larger game. If the day came that Rhaenys or Aegon sought to press a Targaryen claim, they would need more than swords from one Sellsword company. They would need fleets, they would need wealth, and they would need the silent acceptance or open backing of powerful lords. For Elia, these travels were bittersweet. She was glad her brother was forging a new life for them, but she longed for Dorne, for the sound of desert winds, for the taste of Dornish peppers and the songs of her homeland. Often, she would take the children to the rooftop terrace of the villa and look westward, imagining the sun setting over the red mountains. Rhaenys, growing older, would ask, "Mother, will we ever see Dorne?" Elia would smile softly and answer, "One day, perhaps, when it is safe." Aegon, too young to remember much of King's Landing, lived in a world of bright Essosi colors and languages. He learned some Pentoshi phrases, spoke with the local children who visited on rare occasions. In him, Elia saw glimmers of rigor, delicate features, earnest eyes, but also the resolve of Oberyn, that fiery Martell spirit. Oberyn, when he returned from his journeys, taught Rhaenys how to defend herself. He gave her a wooden sword, shorter than the spears he favored, and showed her the stances. She was hesitant at first, remembering the horror of the Red Keep, but Oberyn was patient, turning lessons into a game. Each time she landed a mock strike, he feigned an exaggerated defeat. Over months, her skill increased and she found confidence in movement. With baby Aegon, now a little boy, Oberyn would toss a small ball back and forth in the garden, encouraging him to run and laugh. Yet Oberyn never forgot the reality of their position. He received word that Robert Baratheon had openly rewarded Tywin Lannister for his timely arrival at King's Landing, that Gregor Clegane had been labeled a hero in some twisted rewriting of the truth, and that officially, the Targaryen heirs, including Elia and her children, were declared dead. Their bodies, the rumor said, had been displayed to prove it. Oberyn knew such rumors were manufactured by the Lannisters to curry favor with the new king and to quell any doubts. The realm believed Elia and her children had perished. In a way, that was a blessing, for it allowed them to remain hidden. But Oberyn seethed with fury at the knowledge that Tywin Lannister had once again turned a brutal crime into political advantage. The Red Viper's thirst for vengeance simmered. He had always been known for his hot temper, especially where his sister was concerned. In quiet moments, he imagined driving a spear into Tywin's chest. But vengeance had to wait. Keeping Elia, Rhaenys, and Aegon alive was more important. He forced himself to focus on the future, building a foundation that might one day deliver justice in a grander manner than a single fatal blow. Years slipped by in Essos. The children grew, learned to speak multiple tongues, and discovered that their heritage remained a secret kept even from many of Oberyn's allies. To most, they were the Sand Children, the wards of a wealthy Dornishman who had chosen exile in Essos. Among themselves, they still called each other by their true names. Rhaenys remained close to her mother, and though she asked about her father, Rhaegar, Elia chose her words carefully, painting him as a tragic hero brought down by war. Aegon's curiosity abounded. He tried to piece together how his mother, his uncle, and his sister had come to live in Pentos, but at first the answers were always vague. When he was old enough to understand, Oberyn and Elia took him aside and explained the truth. He was Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne of Westeros, or so many would say. This knowledge weighed heavily upon him. Yet Oberyn reassured him that his first duty was not to a throne but to his family, to stay safe and watchful until the day they decided otherwise. The webs of Oberyn's power continued to grow. He forged friendships in lists with powerful courtesans who had the ears of magisters. He enticed Myrish craftsmen to supply him with fine armaments. He struck deals with Tyroshi pirates to ensure safe passage for certain shipments. In Volantis, he cultivated alliances with merchant princes, subtle but real, exchanging gifts of rare Dornish wines for the promise of protection in the event that any Westerosi agents came sniffing around. The Golden Company remained a crucial ally, though Oberyn could never be entirely sure of their loyalty, for coin was the measure of loyalty in Essos. But so long as he paid generously, they kept their oath. Over time, key officers within the company became personally invested in the Targaryen children, recalling their own exiled lineage's devotion to Targaryen rule. that gave Oberyn hope that their loyalty might run deeper than pure coin. All the while, Elia became a figure of quiet influence, too. Some of the wives and consorts of magisters flocked to her small gatherings at the villa, drawn by her gentle grace and the mystique of her rumored noble blood. She arranged small salons where poetry was recited, and music from both Westeros and Essos was performed. In these gatherings, she gleaned bits of political gossip, learning which Pentoshi factions rose or fell, which alliances formed or collapsed. She became skilled at guiding conversation, drawing out confidences without revealing her own secrets. The knowledge she gained funneled to Oberyn, helping him anticipate potential threats or seize new opportunities. In those same gatherings, Rhaenys and Aegon appeared as well-dressed Dornish children, introduced simply as nieces and nephews of their host. Rhaenys occasionally entertained the guests with a dance she had learned from the courtesans of Lys. Aegon stayed mostly in the background but listened keenly. No one suspected that these bright-eyed youths were anything more than they seemed, though a few sharp-eyed visitors whispered that the boy looked very much like a Targaryen in the shape of his face. Rumors circulated, but Oberyn dismissed them with laughter and well-placed bribes. Eventually, the time came when Oberyn realized that their footing in Pentos was both a blessing and a constraint. He had the beginnings of a power base, yes, but if he remained in Pentos indefinitely, the local magisters might begin to see him as a threat to their own dominion. The uneasy balance could shift quickly if any one magister decided that handing over a potential Targaryen claimant to the Iron Throne might earn him lavish rewards from King Robert or Tywin Lannister. Oberyn needed to expand carefully to ensure no single city could turn on them. He began to sponsor small expeditions across the Narrow Sea, sending goods to minor lords in Westeros under false names. Dorne's discreet support helped him funnel certain luxuries, spices, wines, cloth, into the southern ports of Westeros, earning quiet friendships among lords who had not forgotten Elia's kindness or who still cherished the memory of Rhaegar. Through these channels, Oberyn tested the waters of Westerosi sentiment. He learned that Robert was popular in the Stormlands but faced resentment in the Crownlands, where Targaryen loyalists still harbored old grudges. The North was loyal to Eddard Stark, who had no love for the Targaryens but admired justice over wanton slaughter. The Reach followed Mace Tyrell, who had once backed the Targaryens but now seemed content with Baratheon rule so long as the Tyrells prospered. The Vale was under the guardianship of Jon Arryn, Robert's staunch ally. Each region had its complexities, but Oberyn gleaned that the realm was far from united beneath the new monarchy. Seeds of discord lingered. All these years, Oberyn retained his hatred for the Lannisters. Knowing that the Mountain had been killed at Oberyn's hand in that bloody chamber had not lessened his desire for justice. Rhaegar was just one sword in Tywin's arsenal, a blunt instrument of terror. Tywin himself remained the true architect of Elia's torment, the one who had orchestrated the sack of King's Landing. But Tywin stood high as Robert's hand, controlling the realm's finances and many of its decisions. Oberyn could do nothing direct, yet fate took a turn, however, when word reached Pentos that King Robert was planning an opulent tour of the Southern Lords, culminating in a grand tourney in King's Landing. This was an attempt to quell any lingering discontent and to celebrate the might of House Baratheon. Some whispered that the new king drank more than he ruled, and that the realm was actually guided by Tywin's cunning. Others said that Robert's marriage to Cersei Lannister was failing, that the queen had her own ambitions. Oberyn watched from afar, his mind churning with possibilities. Perhaps all was not as stable as it seemed in the Red Keep. He began to wonder if the time for subtlety was ending. Rhaenys was no longer a child, but a young woman of grace and fierce intelligence. Aegon was a boy in his early adolescence, trained in both swordsmanship and the history of his forebears. Elia herself had recovered from much of her trauma, though she would never forget it, and had grown into a poised figure capable of winning hearts with mere smiles. If the seeds of discontent in Westeros began to sprout, House Martell might seize the moment to reintroduce Elia's children as rightful heirs. Doran Martell had grown quiet on the matter, but Oberyn suspected that his older brother was waiting carefully for the perfect opportunity. One night, after Elia had retired and the children were abed, Oberyn paced the courtyard under a full moon, going over the next steps. He was alone except for a guard or two at the gate. He felt the weight of the spear on his back, the old wound in his shoulder twinging with the memory of Gregor's sword. He pictured how Rhaenys and Aegon might one day return to Westeros, perhaps landing with a triumphant host behind them, the Golden Company's banners flying. How sweet it would be to stand upon the shores of Dorne, greet Prince Doran, and reveal to the realm that Elia's children lived, and that they had come to reclaim a birthright. He also felt a pang of guilt. He did not want to plunge Westeros into war merely for vengeance. He wanted to protect his sister and her children. If claiming the throne led to another bloody conflict, was it worth it? Could they unify the realm instead of dividing it? If the Targaryen cause still lived, it needed to be more than just a cause of revenge and old loyalties. It needed to promise a better future than Robert could provide. Oberyn was not blind to the flaws of Targaryen rule, nor was he unaware that Aerys' madness had left deep scars. But perhaps Rhaenys or Aegon, guided by Elia's gentleness and Oberyn's resolve, could be a different kind of monarch, if they even chose to claim the throne at all. A voice broke him from his reverie. "Uncle Oberyn," came Rhaenys' soft tone. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, wearing a light cloak over her nightrobe. Moonlight played on her dark hair, highlighting the angular cheekbones she had inherited from House Martell, set against the Targaryen violet in her eyes, though it was faint, easily mistaken for a trick of the moonlight unless one looked closely. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I heard you walking out here." He offered a small smile. "Restless thoughts." She approached, folding her arms. "I think about home sometimes," she admitted. "I know Pentos is our home now, but I remember the water gardens even though I was very little. Mother always told me stories, and you told me stories about Dorne when I was younger. I want to see it with my own eyes. Not as a fugitive, but as a princess returning home." Oberyn's chest tightened at her words. "You will one day, that I promise." She studied him, a seriousness in her gaze beyond her years. "You and Mother never say it outright, but I know what I am, who I am. I'm Rhaenys Targaryen, daughter of the Crown Prince. If I'm going to take up that name, shouldn't I do more than hide behind these walls?" He placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "I hide you away to keep you safe. If the realm knew you were alive, they would hunt us," she finished for him, her tone steady but tinged with sadness. "But eventually we'll have to show ourselves. We can't stay exiles forever." He took a breath. "When the time is right, we will move. Not before. Remember that the Lannisters and King Robert are still powerful, and the realm is not eager for another war." She cast her eyes down. "I know, but sometimes it feels cowardly." Oberyn's voice gentled. "There is no cowardice in survival, my dear. It takes courage to keep living, to keep hoping, when everything has been taken from you. And you are still young. You have decades ahead of you to shape your destiny. Rushing into a war without the support to win would only cost more innocent lives." Rhaenys nodded slowly, then stepped closer to hug him. She was nearly as tall as he was now, and that realization made his heart twist. She was a grown woman in many respects, shaped by the tragedy of her early years, yet she still needed guidance. He hugged her back, murmuring, "We will build a new future, Rhaenys. We must be patient." She pulled back, eyes glistening. "I trust you, Uncle." In the months that followed, Oberyn redoubled his efforts to solidify alliances across Essos. He quietly funded a pair of trading vessels that flew neutral Pentoshi flags but were crewed by men loyal to him. These ships began to establish routes along the coast, transporting goods that served as discreet bribes or tokens of goodwill to those in positions of influence. Some cargo, too, found its way to Dorne, hidden in crates whose manifest simply read olive oil or carpets. Enclosed within were letters, messages coded in subtle ways that only Doran Martell and his advisors could decipher. Tension built within Oberyn. Whispers reached him that Robert's rule was stable on the surface but shaky beneath. The small council was said to be divided, with Varys, the master of whisperers, weaving his own intrigues, and Littlefinger controlling the coin. Tywin was older now, but no less imposing. Ned Stark had left King's Landing to return to Winterfell, mistrustful of the capital. Meanwhile, across Westeros, lords who had once held Targaryens in esteem grew discontent with Robert's increasingly self-indulgent ways. It was not open rebellion, but the seeds of future conflict existed. Oberyn considered whether he should attempt a marriage alliance for Rhaenys in Essos, something that might bring more swords or gold to their cause. But Elia, hearing this idea, shook her head. She is still young, and we must not barter her away like a piece on the Syvas board, Elia said. We know that is how the game is played, but I cannot bear to see her future entirely dictated by politics. She sighed. Give her time. Let her choose for herself. She has already lost so much. Oberyn understood, though he also knew the day might come when a marriage alliance was the difference between victory and defeat. He decided to wait. Meanwhile, he arranged tutors to instruct Rhaenys and Aegon in the arts of statecraft, language, and letters, as well as combat training. If they ever returned to Westeros, they would do so as learned individuals, not naive children. They grew adept in the ways of Essos, learning to speak Pentoshi, Myrish, and a little Volantene. They sparred with wooden swords in the courtyard and read ancient tomes on Targaryen history. Occasionally, Elia would show them Rhaegar's harp, which she had managed to smuggle out of King's Landing with Oberyn's help, though she rarely played it, for the memories it evoked were painful. Slowly, the rumor of a Dornish princeling who had made a new life in Essos became common knowledge in certain circles. Some said he was a merchant lord, others whispered he was a spymaster, and a few speculated that he might even be an agent for Prince Doran. All these rumors contained shards of truth, but none captured the entire story. Oberyn cultivated an air of mystery intentionally. That mystique helped shield the children's true identities. At times, visitors from Westeros arrived in Pentos on business, including certain bannermen of the crown. Oberyn avoided them carefully, or if he encountered them by chance in the city's markets or squares, he wore a hood and spoke with a false accent, ensuring they never caught more than a passing glance. His men were ever watchful. Had anyone recognized him for who he truly was, a Martell prince presumed to be in Dorne, questions would have swirled. If they uncovered the presence of Elia and her children, the consequences would be dire. Despite the secrecy, life in Pentos was not devoid of joys. Oberyn and his retinue occasionally hosted small feasts in the villa's courtyard, celebrating Dornish customs. A traveling minstrel from Bravos might perform, or a dancer from Lys might captivate the guests. Elia played the gracious hostess, and the children mingled with visiting merchants. The laughter and music reminded them all that they were not merely exiles. They were a family, trying to find happiness in a foreign land. Rhaenys danced gracefully, and Aegon would grin as he sampled new wines, watered down for his youth, and listened to tales of distant islands. The Golden Company, meanwhile, stationed a rotating group of a dozen men near the villa at all times. Their presence was discreet, hidden among the staff, but Oberyn noticed the difference in the children's sense of safety. They no longer jumped at shadows. Rhaenys practiced sparring with a few of the Sellswords, learning to handle a spear nearly as tall as she was, and homage to her uncle's famous weapon. Aegon showed natural skill with a blade, though Oberyn made sure the boy learned footwork, strategy, and archery, too. A warrior is more than a strong arm, he reminded him. You must think, anticipate, and adapt. Aegon listened with the eager intensity of someone who understood that the fate of an entire legacy might someday rest on his shoulders. Yet it was not all training and strategy. Aegon discovered a love for reading tales of knights and heroes, especially those set during the early years of Targaryen rule, when dragons still soared. Sometimes, Oberyn would see the boy enthralled by a dusty tome, dreaming of the day when House Targaryen might again command the loyalty of dragons. Oberyn knew that no living dragons remained, at least none known to men, but he did not discourage Aegon's fascination. A dream could be powerful fuel. After years in Pentos, Oberyn received an intriguing proposal through the clandestine network of letters that passed between him and Prince Doran. Doran hinted that the time might be nearing for a more active approach in Westeros. Whispers told of Robert's extravagance, of discontent among certain lords, and of the tension brewing between the king and his queen, who was rumored to have taken lovers. The realm might soon be ripe for an upheaval, especially if certain secrets about the royal family's lineage came to light. In other words, if the Lannisters were undermining Robert's reign from within, an outside claimant might find allies in unexpected places. Oberyn weighed these tidings carefully. Raising open rebellion was still too risky, but perhaps a small expedition, a test of support, might be in order. He wrote back to Doran, suggesting that if any of the Stormlords or Crownlander lords who once supported the Targaryens showed interest, Oberyn could arrange a meeting, secretly on neutral ground in Essos. Plans were made for certain envoys to slip across the sea, disguised as merchants. Doran would coordinate discreetly from Dorne. Elia, upon hearing of this, grew anxious. She worried that all their careful secrecy might unravel. Oberyn assured her that no one would meet the children yet. Only himself and a select few members of the Golden Company would be present at these covert talks. If the lords proved untrustworthy, Oberyn would feign ignorance. "We lose nothing but time," he said. "But if they are genuine, we gain potential allies." Late one night, a small Myrish galley arrived in Pentos carrying two men who claimed to be merchants of spices. In truth, they were bannermen of House Rosby, a minor crownland's house that had once served the Targaryens faithfully. Oberyn greeted them in a low-lit chamber, guarded by two of his best men. The Rosby envoys shared hushed tales of King Robert's disinterest in governance, Queen Cersei's rumored indiscretions, and the cunning presence of the Lannisters who bled the realm dry. They voiced regret that they had not done more to save the Targaryen children back then. Oberyn remained guarded but allowed them to speak. In the end, they professed their willingness to support a Targaryen restoration if it ever came. Oberyn did not reveal that the children were alive. Instead, he spoke hypothetically. If there were a legitimate Targaryen heir, would House Rosby risk the wrath of the Iron Throne to support them? The envoys exchanged glances, then said yes, if enough other houses joined. So it was always the same. No one would move alone, but if a coalition formed, they might risk it. This pattern repeated with a few other visits from lesser houses, some from the Reach, some from the Stormlands. Men who felt sidelined by Robert's favoritism toward the Lannisters. None of these men committed openly, for the risk was too high. But Oberyn took note of their names. Slowly, a list formed of potential supporters, men who might be turned if the conditions were right. Back at the villa, Rhaenys and Aegon continued their training, their studies, oblivious to the details of these negotiations but aware that something was shifting in the air. Aegon would ask, "Uncle, are we closer to going home?" Oberyn would answer, "Closer, yes, but not quite yet." Elia prayed to the Seven each morning for the safety of her children. She saw the buildup of alliances as a necessary step, but she dreaded war. She had seen firsthand what war did to innocent people. "If we do return to Westeros," she told Oberyn one day, "let it not be to spread more bloodshed. Let it be to end it." Oberyn nodded, though he knew that forging a new dynasty rarely happened without conflict. Still, he resolved to avoid unnecessary cruelty. Perhaps they could negotiate with Robert. Perhaps if enough lords demanded it, Robert might abdicate. A faint dream, but a dream nonetheless. And so, the years turned, and Oberyn's power in Essos solidified further. He was no longer simply a wandering exile. He was a merchant lord, a master of quiet alliances, a patron of the Golden Company, and the guardian to a secret that could upend the balance of power across the narrow sea. He had saved Elia's children from certain doom, and in doing so, he had carved out a new life for them in the East, a life that grew stronger with every day. But in his heart, Oberyn Martell knew that the game was not done. Their ultimate fate still lay across the sea, in the land of their birth, where the Iron Throne stood as a symbol of conquest and power. One day, a Targaryen might reclaim that throne, either through steel or through compromise, and on that day, the vengeance Oberyn yearned for, the justice Elia deserved, and the future Rhaenys and Aegon represented would all converge. Until that day, they built their power quietly in Essos, forging alliances in the shadows, preparing for the moment when the sun would rise over the narrow sea, and the realm would learn that Elia's children had not perished in King's Landing but had been sheltered by the Red Viper of Dorne. There, hidden amidst the swirling intrigues of Pentos, the seeds of a new dawn were planted, tended by Oberyn Martell's unwavering determination. And though no dragon soared above them, the legacy of the Targaryen name remained unbroken, awaiting the hour when it would unfurl its wings and fly once more.